For this video, I'll be assembling the main side rods and the valve gear. I've got most of the parts laid out here that you can see. As I was examining these, I noticed that most of these parts actually have a lot of oxidation on them, which I didn't really expect, especially considering that these bags are all sealed. Well, they must have been packaged on a humid day or something. In addition to putting the things together, before I actually assemble them to each other, I've also got my polishing supplies out here. So I'm just going to do a quick buffing and straightening of some of these parts before I actually assemble them. So to do the polishing, I'm using this fine emery polish on a felt wheel with my Dremel. So I'll just get a bit of the compound onto there. You can see it made a bit of a white stripe. So now I'll just grip this with some pliers since these parts can get hot real quick when you're buffing. And just gently go across that. You can already see the change. Well, of course, if you're weathering the model or planning to weather it, then this process may not even be necessary. But if you're making it look shiny and new like I like to do, then the buffing can help quite a bit. One of the nice things about these nickel parts is that whatever oxidation forms on them comes off and buffs out very easily. So comparing the two rods, I think you can see there's a pretty big difference. Now, the back isn't really necessary, but I'll go ahead and get it too. And one thing that buffing does, it always leaves some dirt and grit behind, so when you're finished with polishing, just want to wipe that off real quick. You can see just from holding that I've already got some of the dirt on my finger. So even though it may not be very visible on the metal, it's definitely there, and you want to get that cleaned off. Alright, so I'll just do a few more of these and then get on to the actual assembly. I do also have to straighten out these crosshead guides a bit. You can see that's bent. So the easiest way to do that is gently grip it with some smooth pliers. Give a little squeeze here and there. Just real gently straighten that out. And since the actual crosshead guide on this model is a wire instead of this piece itself, it doesn't really matter if it's 100% straight. You more just want it to look good than anything. I'll also buff the side of that a bit, make it look a little better. Okay, wipe that off a bit. And I only buffed the side of this one because the rest of this I'm just going to paint later, so no reason to shine it up or anything. Only buff what's going to be visible. And now with that buffing done, the only preparation left to do is to make sure there are no burrs or anything around these side rods. And their manufacturing process a lot of times left just a small amount in the bottom of the hole. That's easy to get out by just turning a Phillips screwdriver in there a few times. That's nice and smooth now. Do the same for the other one real quick. That looks good enough to me. Now for the crossheads, you also need to clean these up a bit just before they're ready for use. There isn't much flash to clean up around here, fortunately, so I'll just gently grip it that way. and take off that bit of flash that's around the top of the hole. A little more this way. Make sure that's smooth too. And just a bit more in back. It looks like that's about it. So now I'll check that in the cylinders. See how that works. Goes onto the rod just fine, no binding. That feels like it slides back and forth without any problems. I'll be able to tell more easily once I actually get the main rod installed. This way you can at least check to make sure that it's not going to lock up or get stuck or anything. This one also seems to move nice and freely. Feel no binds or stiffness there. So the part holding the crosshead onto the main rod for each side is this really tiny screw. So before I put these together, I just want to check to make sure that these are threading together okay. So I'm just assembling those by hand real gently. It's at a slight angle, but that should still be fine. So they didn't tap that quite straight, but I don't think that'll cause any problems for running. And sometimes when you're testing that out, and if the screw just isn't starting in there, sometimes you can start on the other side instead, and then get the screw all the way through there, sometimes with a screwdriver, just to give it that little extra push. And then that can help to fix any possibly damaged threads on that side of the hole. So now I'll just drop the screw through the center of that. Try and get that threaded in there. There it goes. This can be kind of a tedious part. Not everyone can handle these tiny screws so well, so it can also help to set these parts down on a flat surface, and then maybe if you have just some pliers or tweezers that can hold onto the screw, like just keep that lined up in there while you use a small screwdriver to get that in place. Well, that's another way to do it. But you just have to really just have to find a way to hold on to all these parts while you get them screwed together. And that can be tedious, but it's pretty much always doable. And now to give this a quick test, I'll just slide the crosshead onto there, get it into the cylinder. There it goes. Now when I'm doing the actual assembly here, there's going to be a spacer between the side rod and the main rod. I'm only doing this for a quick test to make sure that there are no binds in the main rod and crosshead. That seems to be moving nice and smoothly. And you'll also notice here that I've left the screw kind of loose, not fully inserted, because I'm going to have to take that out later for installation of the valve gear. But this is at least good for a test, so now I know those parts are moving smoothly, and I can get on with the rest of this. And both sides seem to be working smoothly. I feel no binds coming from those parts. Now that I know that the main rods and crossheads are moving smoothly, I'll go ahead and take those back off so that I can continue with some of the assembly here. So before I finish installing that, I actually need to install these valve rod hangers to the cylinders. This one I've already cleaned up a little. There's only a small amount of flash on there, which you can still see for the one on the other side, right there. It only takes a minute to clean up with a file. And this is supposed to fit into the hole right here, which it looks like that does just fine. No need to drill that any larger. So this part I'll put in with some super glue. Just put a drop right on the side there, and then insert it into the cylinder. Give it a little twisting motion to help the glue spread through, and make sure that is straight on there. That side seems to be fitting just fine too. That's good. And those are both on there. Just need some setting time. All right, so next up here will be one of the crosshead guides. So to put that on, start with just one end of it, lay that on there, and then put the crosshead onto the pin. There we go, now it's going. So those are both sliding on. Then continue to slide on the other side. Actually, I think I need to drill the hole out a tiny bit on this one, so I'll take that back off. Yeah, that seems to be working. I don't know the exact measurement of that drill bit. It's just the one that came with my 080 tap set. It seems like it was just large enough to get that hole to right where it needed to be. There, now it's going on. Slide that forward and line it up with that screw hole. Now take one of these shorter 256 screws. And tighten that onto there. Better make sure that's staying straight, which it looks like it is, at least mostly. Yeah, I think that'll be good. Of course, I should get the crosshead into the cylinder before tightening that, so loosen that screw and try again. Okay, now I can tighten that in there. All sorts of little things to watch when you're building a kit like this. They're not really difficult parts to do, just things to watch out for. So that looks good now. Crosshead's moving freely. I do feel just a slight bind somewhere in there though. Yeah, maybe it's just because of the angle I was holding the rod. So in that case, I'll just try putting this together then and see if it still works smoothly. So now I'll put on that spacer washer. It's just a brass one. Put the screw back in. And that seems to be working just fine. Okay, so now continue for the other side, just the same way. Okay, so I've got both sides on now, and there are just some little binds here and there. Feel like it's coming from this one on the left, actually. See, it might be the position of the guide there. I'll move that back a bit. See if that helps at all. Oh yeah, that feels a lot better. Yeah, sometimes all you have to do is just kind of, well, sometimes just bend parts around a little bit until you have the alignment just right and things are working smooth. And now it feels like this is turning freely. All right, and with that done, I can start building the valve gear. So I've got the valve gear parts laid out here, and it looks like they'll also need a little buffing before I start. But when I do get started, I'll be using this steel plate here that I've got as a good hammering surface. And like all Bowser kits, they include a riveting tool, but this one is really rusted, as you can see. I'm sure it's perfectly fine to use, but I'm going to use my better one that came with a newer Bowser kit. So since these are all straight parts, buffing them will be a quick, easy process, so I'll take care of that now and then get to the actual assembly. And same thing, we'll just use the buffing wheel on there. Alright, I've got the parts buffed and ready to go. And I've got a rivet placed here on my piece of steel, face down and pointing up. So I'll start with the eccentric end. These parts can be hard to grip by hand off the table, so some pliers or tweezers are very helpful in picking them up. Place that carefully down over the rivet. And then take the eccentric. Make sure this is placed correctly on top of there. Okay. Now, place the riveting tool directly centered on top of the rivet. There's a point in the end of the tool, and that lines up with the small hole that's in the end of the rivet. Carefully tap that down to make sure it's flared. We'll give it a little check now and then to make sure you're not overdoing it or underdoing it. The end of the rivet should be lightly flared out, enough to hold things in place, but not enough to bind up. Looks like this one could use a little more. But it's off to a good start. Now once the rivet starts flaring out, it is easy to go a bit too far with it and then cause a bit of binding in the joint. Since they are soft brass though, if that ever happens, sometimes you can kind of wiggle the parts around like this until they start to work smoothly together. After working with it a little more, that's turning nice and freely now. So that won't cause any binding of the mechanism. So now I'll move on to the next rivet. If you find you're having trouble getting the rivets just right for tightness, there is a trick you can do to help with that. So take a thin piece of paper and poke that down over the rivet. Place the next rod down over that rivet. Get the riveting tool lined up just right there. Hammer that down. And the joint will be kind of tight, but then you can get that piece of paper out of there either by tearing it, or I've heard it can also be done by burning. And the paper acts as a spacer while it's being assembled, so then once you take it out, you get a free moving joint. Okay, so there's one side done. When you get the hang of how to put these together, it really only takes a few minutes to do each side. So now I can take the valve gear hanger here And this can be kind of a tedious step because there's so much alignment to do. But you have one of these small screws that goes through here and then through the first part of the valve gear there. Got to keep those parts lined up while doing your best to make sure that doesn't fall apart. Just kind of insert that into there, pull the screw back out a little until you can get this rod down in there. Now if you find that the hanger is a bit too tight, you can bend that out just a little bit. They even say to do that in the instructions, so no problem there. The hard part is getting these things lined up. Eventually though, the parts will line up and go together. And once that is finally done, then the screw can tighten through there. The head of these screws is so fine, sometimes it's hard to keep the screwdriver in there. And then once you get it all the way down, just be careful not to over tighten it. Want to be sure that these can swing back and forth freely. I think I'll back that off just about a half turn. Yeah, I think that'll be good there. So now, let's trim off the end of that screw. There, have to find the right spot to cut it. Finally, to keep that from backing out, put just a little bit of super glue onto the tip of a wire, and then spread that onto the end of that screw. And that'll help to keep it from backing out. Now with both sides of the valve gear assembled, it's time to put this onto the chassis. So I'll start by just laying it on there. And each side needs to have that rod right there inserted into the cylinder. Move this down so it looks like that. And same thing for the other side. Looks like I need to bend this out just slightly. It's very thin metal right there, so that's easy enough to do. I'll deal more with the lining once I've got this actually assembled. So just hold that in place. Oops. And screw that on. Only insert the first one part way. So that makes it a lot easier to line up the second one. Tighten that. And then tighten the other one. Okay. And that's not getting in the way of anything. Good. So now for the eccentric, take this screw off again. This time this tube needs to stay in place so that the assembly can be done properly. One more washer goes over that. And the screw goes through the eccentric and into the wheel. So now, when tightening that, the eccentric needs to have a forward angle of about 15 degrees. So start with it, on the left side, start with it facing forward like that. Tighten that. And that's facing forward more than it needs. So I'll just take my pliers and move that a little more. That's looking about right. So now I'll get the other one in place, just the same way. Now for the right side, you'll want to start out with the eccentric facing backwards. So then, when you tighten the screw, that moves it in the direction needed. And you can twist that the rest of the way with pliers to get the correct angle. Just giving that a test roll to make sure it's working smoothly, which it seems to be. Okay, so now all that's left is the alignment of these parts so that I can make sure the rods can move smoothly in this area. Need to bend that out just a little more. Testing that real quick just to be sure that can move freely. And it looks like that's all good. So now take these screws out from the crossheads. There, put that through the valve gear, back into the crosshead. Okay, it looks like that hole is actually just a bit small, so I'll have to drill that out. I'll use this one again. Okay, with that hole drilled out, that's fitting through a lot better. Bring the main rod back over. Line things up. I'll hold the main rod up with another screwdriver. See if that helps. There we go. Something about this seems off, actually. I did build that according to the instructions. And here's the photos of the model. No, I guess that's right. I think it is. That just looks a lot higher than it's supposed to for some reason. Maybe I have something bent out of shape. Yeah, maybe if I try doing this. Okay, I guess that's correct then. Just seemed like it was a sharper angle upward than it was supposed to be. But I guess that's right for this kit. This seems to be sitting straight now. Feel just a slight bind in there. Feel like this is coming loose, so I'll have to use a little more glue to hold that in place. Okay, I think I've got all the binds pretty well worked out now. It seems to be working smoothly. Just had to get some alignment done up here, make sure the rods had enough clearance to work. So now I've got these screws inserted the rest of the way into the crossheads. Just not quite tight enough to cause any binding. So I'll trim off the excess from these screws. Then, like I did earlier for the valve gear, put just a little bit of glue onto the end of a wire. And spread that onto the end of that screw to make sure it can't back out. Also, one more thing to do. Since the rod here doesn't actually attach to the reverse linkage, what I'll do is just make sure this hole is cleaned out. And take one of these rivets, trim off the end. Put a dot of glue onto that, and then put it into the hole. So that may not be a functional rivet, but it at least looks better than leaving a hole there. And of course, the final step here is to oil every single joint on here. So that's all the valve gear joints, as well as some oil on the guide rod there, little on the piston rod, and the rest of these joints. One last thing you may want to consider doing is trimming off the access from those guide rods. I'll do that later on mine, probably when I'm pulling it apart to paint it. But that'll be it for the assembly of the valve gear. So in the next video, I'll show how to install the original motor, as well as put in a new motor to see just how well I can make this thing run.